The morning Marcus Chen noticed the fence line was the same morning everything started dying. He stood at the edge of his backyard, 3 acres of oak trees, wildflowers, and the rectangular scar of an in-ground pool that had consumed $30,000, countless weekends, and every ounce of joy he'd tried to build into his newly renovated house. The pool gleamed that Saturday morning, perfectly blue, catching the light like a promise he'd made to himself that never quite kept. Sarah was gone, had been gone for 8 months now. The divorce papers were signed. The house was his, bought with his money, though she'd fought hard enough that his lawyer had suggested he simply let her have it and move on. But Marcus hadn't moved on. Marcus was the type of man who dug in, who believed that if you paid for something, if you worked for it, if you sacrificed for it, then at least you deserved to keep it. The pool had been Sarah's idea. "We should have somewhere to relax," she'd said during their 3rd year together, when she was still looking at him like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life. A real home deserves a sanctuary. He'd hired the contractors. He'd watched them dig. He'd signed the checks. And for exactly 2 summers, 2 brief, flickering summers when Sarah would float on an inflatable raft with a glass of wine, and he'd sit beside her on the lounge chairs watching her smile, he'd felt like the sanctuary had worked. Then Sarah had met Derek at CrossFit. Derek owned a tech startup that wasn't worth anything yet but was going to be huge. Derek had the kind of confidence that made successful men nervous and made women forget they'd once been satisfied. Sarah had looked at Marcus one Tuesday evening and said, "I think I might be in love with someone else," with the same casual tone she might use to mention the garbage disposal was broken. The divorce was swift. Ugly in the way divorces are when one person stops trying at the exact moment the other person would have moved mountains. She got the savings she'd brought into the marriage, he got the debt of the renovations, and they split the furniture. The pool she didn't want. The pool she called a money pit. For 6 months, Marcus had maintained it. He'd bought the chemicals, the filters, the cover. He'd skimmed leaves at 6 in the morning before work, and he'd tested the pH level like he was trying to perfect an emotional equation that had no solution. The pool was blue, pristine, lonely. He didn't swim in it once. Then in the fall, when the leaves started dropping and the temperature began to plummet, Marcus made his decision. He called a demolition company. 3 weeks later, here he was, watching the wrecking ball swing. The house next door belonged to neighbors he'd never really known. He'd lived here for 5 years, and they'd moved in 2 years ago. A woman, her name was Corinne, and her 2 kids, a boy around 10, a girl around 8. No man in the picture, though Marcus had seen the occasional truck in the driveway on weekends. Corinne kept to herself, kept her kids to herself too, mostly. They'd exchanged polite waves once or twice. He knew her name because the HOA had sent around some nonsense about maintenance standards, and her name was on the complaint. He'd never asked why she was complaining about his yard. His yard was fine, he maintained it. He paid his dues, he followed the rules. The wrecking ball swung again. The pool's shallow end crumbled like it had been made of sugar, concrete, and fiberglass exploding outward in a cloud of dust. "Stop," a voice cut through the sound of destruction. Marcus turned. Corinne was running toward his property line, barefoot, still in pajamas, pajama pants with some cartoon character on them, a faded college sweatshirt. Her hair was uncombed. She looked younger without makeup and also somehow older, like she was carrying something that erased the years between. "Stop the demolition," she was shouting. "Stop it right now." Marcus raised his hand to halt the operator, though he didn't know why. He wasn't doing anything wrong. The pool was on his property. He'd paid for the demolition himself from his own money to do with as he pleased. But something about her barefoot panic, the way she was moving, made him pause. "Can I help you?" he called out, still polite, still the version of Marcus who believed in civility even when civility wasn't being offered to him. Corinne reached the fence, a simple wire boundary that separated their yards. She was breathing hard, like she'd been running much longer than the 30 feet it took to cross her house. "You can't tear that down," she said. "It's my pool," Marcus replied, "on my property." "Your pool is the only place my kids have to swim in the summer." Corinne's voice was shaking. "Do you know how expensive swim lessons are? Do you have any idea what camps cost? That pool has been their summer, it's been their joy, and you're just destroying it because you're—" She stopped herself, her jaw tightened. "Because you can." Marcus felt something in his chest contract. The wrecking ball operator was waiting, the machine idling with tremendous patient power. Dust settled on the remains of what had been the shallow end. "I didn't know you used it," he said, and he realized as he said it that it was true. He'd never seen her kids in the pool, never seen them at all, really, except for the occasional glimpse of them playing in their own yard. Small shapes, distant, separate from his carefully maintained landscape of grief and isolation. "Of course I used it," Karen said. "Your old wife used to tell me I could before she left, she said." Karen's voice cracked slightly and she breathed in hard through her nose. "She said my kids could swim any time they wanted during the day. She was kind. She was the only neighbor who ever treated us like we mattered." The words landed oddly. Marcus found himself scrolling back through his memory of Sarah, trying to locate this kindness he apparently hadn't known about. It was possible. It was absolutely possible. Sarah had always been generous when it suited her, had always been the type to make grand gestures toward people who needed them, as long as those gestures cost her nothing except time. As long as they made her feel good about herself. "Karen," Marcus said carefully, "I didn't know about any arrangement." "Well, there was one," she said. "And now you're destroying it, and I don't know what to tell my kids. I don't know what to tell them about why the world gets to just take things away like this." She turned and walked back toward her house, moving slower now, like something inside her had broken or given up. Marcus watched her go. The wrecking ball operator looked at him, waiting for a signal. Marcus raised his hand again. "Give me a few minutes," he called out. He went inside and pulled up his contacts. He hadn't spoken to Sarah in 2 months, since the settlement was finalized and there was no legal reason to communicate. But he had her number. He called. She answered on the third ring, and her voice came through sunny and distracted, like he was interrupting something good. "Marcus, is everything okay?" "The pool," he said. "Did you tell the neighbors they could use it?" A pause, a breathing pause where he could feel her remembering, accessing, deciding how to frame the truth. "Yeah," she said finally. "Karen's kids needed somewhere to cool off. It wasn't hurting anything. You were never using it. You made a commitment to people I've never met about my property." "It was the right thing to do," Sarah said, and there was that familiar defiance in her voice. The same voice she'd used when she told him about Derek, when she explained that the love they had was just a comfortable lie she'd gotten used to. "I didn't think you'd care. I thought you were better than you apparently are." She hung up. Marcus stood in his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear, and felt the weight of the decision in front of him. He could call the demolition company back. He could finish what he'd started. The pool was his. The property was his. Nothing had changed legally. Everything had changed morally, and he found himself resenting that fact with an intensity that surprised him. He was a good man. He'd always believed he was a good man. He paid his bills. He followed the rules. He treated people with respect even when they didn't deserve it. He'd tried so hard to be good that when Sarah left him, he'd somehow made it an indictment of his goodness rather than her choices. But this moment, standing in his kitchen with dust still settling on the remains of his pool and the image of Karen's bare feet on his property line, and her voice cracking when she talked about what she would tell her kids, this didn't feel like goodness. This felt like something else. This felt like spite dressed up as autonomy. Marcus set the phone down on the counter. He pulled on shoes. He walked back outside to the demolition operator. "Cancel it," he said, "for today." The operator shrugged, unbothered. This was all the same to him, the money flowed either way. He shut down the machinery and began disassembling the equipment. It would cost Marcus money to restart. Money he'd already spent, money he wouldn't get back. For the second time in a year, he found himself losing something he'd paid for. The geometry of it was bitter, but he walked toward Karen's fence anyway. She answered the door before he knocked. She'd gotten dressed, jeans, a work shirt with a name tag that said Miller Hardware. She'd also been crying, though she was trying to hide it. "I stopped the demolition," Marcus said, "for now." Karen's expression shifted through several emotions at once. Relief, suspicion, shame, gratitude. They flickered across her face like channel changes. "Why?" she asked. "Because Sarah told me about the arrangement, and because—" Marcus paused, trying to find language that felt true. "Because your kids shouldn't have to learn that kind of lesson yet, that life just takes things away sometimes. They can use the pool, you both can, come over whenever you want during the day." Karen's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different, cleaner somehow. "Thank you," she whispered. Thank you, I'll keep them out of your way. You won't even know they're using it, I promise. She shut the door gently, and Marcus walked back to his house, where the wrecking ball sat dormant and ready, waiting for the next decision. He hadn't made a decision at all, he realized. He just delayed one. The pool was still a monument to something dead. It was still a wound. But now it belonged to more people than just him, and somehow that made it feel a little less like a wound and a little more like a scar, something that might eventually fade. The first time he heard the kids laugh in the pool, that Monday afternoon when they came over after school and Karen watched from the fence with her arms wrapped around herself, Marcus was inside his house, pretending he wasn't listening. The sound came through the open window, bright and unself-conscious, the specific joy of children who didn't yet know that joy was temporary. He closed his eyes and let it exist. It would be the last pure moment of goodness he'd feel about his decision to keep the pool standing. By mid-June, the pool had become Karen's property in every way that mattered. Not legally. The title was still Marcus's, the insurance still his, the maintenance responsibilities still technically his burden. But in the way that things become what they're used for, in the way that ownership becomes a formality when someone else has already claimed the space in their heart and their summer schedule, the pool belonged to Karen and her children. Marcus noticed it first in small ways. The gate he'd installed for maintenance access now had a permanent hook on it where Karen's key hung. The filter system developed a rattle, and instead of calling him about it, Karen simply started coming over to tinker with it herself, her head bent under the equipment, her hands stained with algae and rust. The concrete around the edge accumulated towels, beach toys, a small flip-flop that belonged to her daughter Emma. Sarah, the old Sarah, the kind one that Karen remembered, would have loved this. The generosity of the gesture, the way it made her seem noble and compassionate. But Marcus wasn't that person. He'd never been that person, not really. He was the one who paid the bills and kept the spreadsheets and wondered why everyone around him confused his competence with his capacity to absorb unlimited sacrifice. Still, he said nothing. He let it happen. By July, he'd created a routine that was almost religious in its attempt to avoid his own property. He'd wake at 6, work out at the gym on the other side of town, spend his lunch breaks at the office instead of coming home, and return only when he was certain the backyard would be empty. It was during one of these returns, a Friday evening, coming home early because a meeting had been canceled, that he found Karen standing in his backyard without asking permission. She was standing at the deep end of the pool, staring down into it with her arms crossed. She hadn't seen him yet. She was still wearing her hardware store shirt, her hair pulled back in a bun that had come half undone. There was something about the set of her shoulders that made Marcus approach cautiously, like he was walking toward something fragile. "Hi," he said quietly. She flinched, turning fast. For just a moment he saw it, the raw exhaustion, the kind that lives deeper than skin. Then she reshaped her face into something more presentable. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I know you prefer us to come during specific times. I just needed to check on the filter. It's making that sound again. I think something's caught in the intake." "You don't have to apologize," Marcus found himself saying. "It's fine, really, come whenever you want." Karen nodded, but she didn't move. She turned back to looking at the pool, and Marcus realized there was something she wasn't saying. "Everything okay?" he asked, and hated himself for asking because it opened a door he didn't want opened. "My ex," Karen said quietly, still looking at the water. "He moved back to the area. He's demanding more custody, threatening to sue, says I'm not providing enough enrichment, I guess he called it. Cultural experiences, structured activities. He's a lawyer." She said this last part like it explained everything, like being a lawyer was synonymous with being cruel in a way that was sanctioned by the system. "That sounds stressful," Marcus said, which was the kind of empty platitude he'd been trained to offer but which now felt inadequate to the weight of what she was telling him. "It is," Karen said. "He makes 3 times what I make. He's already implying that I can't afford to give them what they need. This pool," she gestured at it. "This is the one thing he can't buy them. It's not expensive, it's free. It's here because you let it be here, and I'm terrified that when he finds out he's going to use it somehow. Going to find a way to make me look bad for not being able to provide this myself." Marcus felt the familiar, uncomfortable sensation of someone else's life becoming his responsibility. This was how it always started. Someone shared a burden, and you felt obligated to carry it. He'd spent his marriage doing this, absorbing Sarah's anxieties and insecurities like a sponge absorbs water. He'd promised himself he'd learned better. But Corinne's daughter Emma had somehow inherited Marcus's old habit of coming up to the glass door and waving at him when she thought he wasn't watching. She taught her little brother David to do it too. They were small, uncomplicated children who didn't yet understand that the world was divided into those who could afford joy and those who couldn't. "Of course you can use it," Marcus heard himself say. "It's completely free, no cost whatsoever, anytime you want." Corinne turned to him and her eyes were shiny. "Really?" "Really," he said, and meant it in that moment. "The way you mean things when you're prioritizing someone else's needs over your own emerging resentment." She thanked him profusely, embarrassingly, and he excused himself to go inside, where he poured a drink he didn't really want and wondered at what point kindness becomes a loss of self. The summer deepened. The filter rattled. Marcus called a professional repair service and put it on his credit card. The pool's walls developed a crack, nothing structural, just cosmetic, but he had it sealed. He bought a new cover for the winter. He installed solar heating because he'd heard Corinne mention that it would be nice if they could use it even in late September. None of this was necessary. All of it was his choice. But somehow the choices were hardening into a kind of obligation, the kind where saying no would make him the villain in his own life. It started in August, small enough that Marcus almost missed it. He came home to find Corinne's sister Margaret sitting on his lounge chair with a bottle of wine, her feet up on his outdoor table. Margaret was visiting from out of town. Corinne explained, "Wasn't that nice?" The kids were inside watching a movie. Corinne had thought they could have a little wine by the pool while they had some peace and quiet. She hoped he didn't mind. He minded, but he didn't say so. He sat with them for 20 minutes, listened to Margaret talk about her divorce and her successful real estate career in Phoenix, and excused himself when he couldn't bear the niceness of it anymore. Then there was the incident with David's birthday party. Corinne knocked on his door one Saturday morning in mid-August, dressed in a sundress, her hair blown out. Behind her, he could see balloons tied to her fence. "I'm so sorry to ask," she began, which was how she always began now, "but would it be okay if we had David's birthday party here? His dad is taking them out to dinner that evening, which is fine, great, I'm not trying to keep him from his father, but I wanted to do something nice during the day. Just family, a few neighborhood kids. They'd probably want to swim. Would that be?" "Of course," Marcus said. He didn't even let her finish. "Do whatever you need." And so his house became the venue for a child's birthday party, 12 kids shrieking with the joyful abandon that summer gives them. Corinne ran around with her sister, organizes games, served hot dogs and cake, made sure no one drowned. She was good at it, at creating space for happiness. She was exactly the kind of mother and neighbor that made the world feel less sharp-edged. Marcus left and drove to the lake, where he sat in his car for 3 hours reading a book he didn't retain, listening to the silence that had become his natural state. When he returned, the party was over. Corinne was cleaning up, gathering cups and plates, scrubbing the deck. He helped her without saying much. She thanked him as she always did, that earnest, excessive gratitude that made him feel like a villain for not feeling as gracious as she needed him to be. "You're a good person," Corinne said, and he heard in those words all the ways he was failing to be a good person. Because a good person would do this gladly, would do it without the creeping resentment that was beginning to metastasize in his chest. By September, Marcus had made a decision that felt like inevitability rather than choice. He was going to keep the pool. Not because he wanted it, but because taking it away now would hurt people, and he'd been taught, raised, conditioned, made to understand on a cellular level that hurting people was the worst thing you could do. So he would keep the pool. He would maintain it. He would let Corinne and her children use it. He would swallow the loss and call it charity. He didn't realize he was becoming resentful until the day he truly understood it. It was late September, Indian summer still holding on to the valley, the days still warm enough to justify one more season of swimming. Marcus had come home from work to find Corinne in his pool, actually in it, not hovering around the edges. She was doing laps, swimming with the efficiency of someone who'd taken lessons as a child, who understood her body in water. Emma and David played cannonball games at the shallow end, their shrieks carrying over his fence into the evening air. He watched from behind the glass door of his house, and he felt something shift in him, something click into place like a lock finally finding its key. He'd been angry. He'd been angry for months now, and he'd been so focused on not showing it, on maintaining the fiction of his own goodness, that he'd stopped noticing it was there. He was angry that Sarah had made promises on his property. He was angry that Karen had accepted those promises. He was angry that he'd been too weak to say no, and angry that he'd been punished for that weakness by having to keep saying yes. But more than any of that, he was angry that Karen had won something from him without even asking for it. That she'd come to his property needing something, and through the simple fact of her need, she'd extracted it. And now when he looked at his own home, he didn't see his sanctuary. He saw hers. The pool had belonged to his marriage once, and he'd used it to try to hold Sarah close. Now it belonged to Karen's motherhood, and he'd used it to try to be the kind of man that Sarah had said he wasn't. Both times the pool was a lie. Both times he'd been swimming in someone else's dream. Marcus went upstairs to his bedroom, closed the door, and for the first time in months he let himself cry. Not sad tears, angry ones, the kind that felt like they were making something worse instead of better. When he stopped, he pulled out his phone and looked up the demolition company's number again. He didn't call, he set the phone down, but he saved the number as a contact and named it Freedom and left it there like a promise to himself. By the end of September, as the weather began its inevitable shift toward autumn, Marcus had begun the slow work of reclaiming his resentment. He stopped fixing things around the pool. When the filter made that sound, he didn't call the repair company. When leaves accumulated at the bottom, he didn't skim them. He began to let it deteriorate, slowly, subtly, in ways that Karen would notice but might not immediately understand. He was poisoning the well. He was taking back his generosity 1 micron at a time. And he was going to keep doing it until Karen understood that gifts, real gifts, couldn't be extracted like teeth from stone. They had to be offered freely, and he was ready to stop offering. The moment when everything came apart arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, when Karen showed up at his door with an entirely different expression on her face. Karen didn't knock. She used his doorbell, the kind of formal announcement that suggested she wasn't coming to ask a favor. Marcus opened the door to find her wearing her hardware store uniform, her hair pulled back severely, her jaw set in a way that made her look older, colder, almost dangerous. Beside her stood another woman, older with the unmistakable bearing of someone used to being obeyed. Behind them, Marcus could see a man in a car parked on the street, city inspector stickers on his windshield. "We have an issue," Karen said without preamble. "This is Janet Hallbrook. She's the city's code enforcement officer. She's here because your pool doesn't meet current safety regulations." Marcus felt his stomach drop in a way that was almost physical. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Janet Hallbrook stepped forward with the tired professionalism of someone who'd had this conversation 100 times. "Your pool was installed 6 years ago before the 2018 revised safety codes. At that time, they grandfathered in existing pools. However, if a pool falls below a certain threshold of maintenance, staining, deterioration, structural concerns, it's considered abandoned, and when an abandoned pool is brought to the city's attention, it's required to be brought up to code or demolished." "It's not abandoned," Marcus said. "It's actively maintained and used." "My children use it," Karen interjected. "Every day, and I've documented that it's deteriorating. The inspection photos will confirm that." Marcus turned to look at her, and he finally understood what he was seeing. This wasn't the desperate, grateful Karen who'd asked about the pool back in spring. This was someone else entirely. This was Karen who'd been planning something for a while, possibly since the moment she'd realized he was letting the pool decay. "Did you file a complaint?" he asked. "I did," Karen said calmly, "because safety is important. Because when you let something like a pool deteriorate, it becomes a liability for the neighborhood, for my children. You filed a complaint that will require me to either spend $50,000 bringing it to code or demolish it," Marcus said slowly, understanding now. "After spending all summer using it for free." "I'm protecting my children," Karen said, and there was something in her voice, something that seemed to be the truth but not the whole truth. "And the city made a determination based on its codes. I'm not responsible for the city's regulations." Janet Hallbrook shifted uncomfortably. She clearly sensed the emotional terrain she was navigating. "Look," she said, "the way the code works is that once a complaint is filed, I'm required to inspect. Once I inspect and document deterioration, action has to be taken. I can give you 60 days to decide, rehabilitate or demolish, but the decision needs to be made by then." "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked. "Then the city can move forward with penalties and forced removal. It usually gets expensive fast. Most people choose demolition. She handed him a folder with the inspection report, the photos showing every place where he'd let the pool decay. It was damning in its documentation. The filter that hadn't been serviced in weeks, the leaves and algae accumulation, the crack he'd ignored, the overall impression of something that had been abandoned. Karen watched him read it with an expression that might have been sympathy, if sympathy could be delivered with a closed fist. "You want me to demolish it," Marcus said flatly. "That's what this is about. You want to use the city's codes to force me to get rid of something I paid for." "I want you to make a decision about your property," Karen said. "Just like you made a decision this summer to let my children use it. Decisions have consequences, Marcus, for all of us." Janet Holbrook excused herself with visible relief, handing him another card and mentioning something about calling if he had questions. She walked back to her car, and Marcus and Karen stood in the doorway while the October morning moved around them with its casual indifference to the fact that everything had changed. "Why would you do this?" Marcus asked. "Why would you complain about something you've been using all summer?" Karen was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer, but also sadder, like she was disappointed in herself for what she was about to tell him. "My ex is taking me back to court next month," she said. "He's fighting for full custody. He's got lawyers, Marcus, good ones, and he's going to argue that I can't provide for my children adequately, that our home situation is unstable, that I don't have the financial resources or the stability that they need. And then he found out about this pool. He found out that I was using my neighbor's pool because I couldn't afford to provide my own resources for my children's summer." She paused, and in that pause, Marcus understood the entire strategy. "He used it against me," Karen continued. "In court filings, stated it as evidence that I'm dependent on the charity of others, that I'm financially unstable and emotionally irresponsible for raising my children without adequate resources. My lawyer said I needed to either get my own pool or create a situation where I couldn't use it anymore, where it wasn't an option." "So you're using the city's codes to force me to destroy it," Marcus said. "And then when your ex asks about the pool, you can honestly say it doesn't exist anymore." "Yes," Karen said simply, "because I can't be the person who has to depend on you to give my children a summer. I can't have my own failures as a provider be documented in legal filings. And I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm genuinely sorry. But my children are more important than your property. They're more important than your feelings about this situation. They're the only people in the world who actually need me to be strong." She said it so calmly, so reasonably. Like this wasn't a betrayal. Like this was just the natural consequence of him trying to be good in a world where goodness could be weaponized against you. "You got me to keep the pool open," Marcus said slowly, working through the logic. "You made me feel guilty about demolishing it. You thanked me. You made me feel generous. And then you filed a complaint that will destroy my property and force me to deal with the city." "I gave my children one good summer," Karen said. "And I gave you the chance to show me what kind of person you really were. Turns out you're the kind of person who can be made to do things by appeals to your guilt. You're the kind of person who doesn't have real boundaries. You're the kind of person who lets people use him." The words landed with precision. They were mean, and more than that, they were true in a way that made Marcus feel like his entire foundation was shifting. "I don't hate you," Karen said. "I want to be clear about that, but I can't afford to be grateful to you. I can't afford to be indebted to someone for my children's happiness. It makes me weak. And weakness in a custody fight becomes ammunition. So I'm making a choice. I'm choosing my children. I'm choosing to protect them from the appearance of instability. And that means destroying this thing between us before my ex can use it to destroy me." She turned to leave. "Wait," Marcus said. "What if I fight this? What if I tell the city that I actually use the pool, that it's not abandoned?" "Your pool maintenance records are with the hardware store," Karen said without looking back. "I work at the hardware store. I know you haven't bought chemicals in 7 weeks. I know you haven't purchased a single maintenance item since mid-August. You let it deteriorate, Marcus. You did that. And now you have to decide if you want to pay $50,000 to fix a mistake or just accept that it's over and move on." She walked back across his lawn to her house, and Marcus stood in his doorway watching her go, understanding with a kind of sickly clarity that she'd been planning this moment since the summer started. Since he'd asked her not to use the pool, and she'd smiled at him with gratitude and already been thinking about how to use that gratitude against him. He'd been played, And the worst part was that she'd played him by recognizing something true about him. His need to be liked, his fear of being the villain, his inability to say no and stand behind that no with any real conviction. That afternoon, Marcus called the demolition company and scheduled the pool to be removed. The operator who'd been there in the spring remembered him, asked if this was the ladies' pool or his pool now. Marcus said nothing, just scheduled the appointment for 2 weeks out. He paid the new deposit, money he couldn't really afford, coming so soon after the first failed demolition. He sent Karen an email. The pool will be demolished on October 22nd at 8 a.m. You'll want to tell your children before then. She didn't respond. What she did instead was go to the school where Marcus served on the PTA board and talk to the principal, who mentioned to Marcus, casually, that it was unfortunate that he was removing a valuable neighborhood resource. What she did was speak to the HOA president and suggest that Marcus had promised a community amenity that he was now reneging on, which created a liability concern. What she did was tell people at her church about this neighbor who seemed so kind but was actually very selfish, and how she'd tried so hard to work with him, but that some people just couldn't be reasoned with. By the time the demolition date arrived, Marcus had received 3 separate messages from neighbors he'd never spoken to before, asking if he could please reconsider, because it would be such a shame to destroy something that had become so important to the community. A community of 6 families, 3 of whom had also been using his pool without permission, without an invitation, just treating it as an open resource now that Karen had somehow made it feel like that was acceptable. The morning of October 22nd, Marcus woke early. He stood in his bedroom looking out at his backyard for the last time at the pool that still glistened blue in the pre-dawn light, and he felt something settle inside him that he recognized as a kind of peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but the peace of finality, the relief that comes when you stop fighting a current and let it take you where it's going. The wrecking ball arrived at 7. The operator was a different person this time. She was professional, didn't ask questions, just backed the equipment into position. By 7:45 a.m., the machine was running. At 8:04 a.m., the first impact of the wrecking ball hit the deep end. Marcus watched from his bedroom window. He didn't go outside this time. He didn't need to hear the destruction. He just needed to know it was happening. The phone call came from Karen's ex-husband, Michael Torres. Marcus knew this not because Karen had ever mentioned him, but because the caller ID said, Michael Torres, attorney at law. And because even before Marcus answered, he understood that this was the inevitable next part of the story. Is this Marcus Chen? The voice asked, educated, confident, carrying the weight of a man used to winning arguments. Yes, Marcus said. He was still watching the wrecking ball, watching it swing again, watching the deep end collapse into rubble. This is Michael Torres, Karen's ex-husband. I understand you're demolishing a pool that my children have been using this summer. A pool that, according to Karen, was made available to them as an act of goodwill from a generous neighbor. Is that correct? Marcus felt the trap closing. He understood now that Karen hadn't been playing him for the summer. She'd been playing the long game all along, and the long game included having her ex-husband call him, having him extract some kind of concession or statement that could be used in court. The pool is on my property, Marcus said carefully. I'm free to do what I want with it. Of course, Michael said smoothly. But the question for our custody dispute is not whether you're free to demolish it. The question is whether you're deliberately causing harm to my children by destroying a resource they depended on. And I think you'll find that family courts take that kind of deliberate harm very seriously, particularly when combined with the established pattern of this resource being available to them, used by them, relied upon by them for their summer activities. That's insane, Marcus said, though he could already hear the echo of how this might be framed in a courtroom. Unstable neighbor, emotional cruelty toward children, vindictive behavior meant to harm them. Is it, Michael said, or is it just a father protecting his children's interests? You gave them something all summer. You made them believe they had access to something valuable, and now you're taking it away right before they go back to school. In what world does that not look like cruelty? In the world where it's my property, Marcus said again, but his voice had changed. It had lost the certainty it had been carrying. Absolutely, Michael said. Again, you're within your rights. But Karen's lawyer will file a statement with the court documenting that you deliberately damaged a resource that was integral to the children's summer care. that you did this after Karen expressed how important it was to them. I think you'll find that family courts don't look kindly on adults who deliberately harm children, even if they're technically within their legal rights to do so. The wrecking ball swung again. The edge crumbled, $50,000 of beautiful nothing. I'm not trying to harm anyone, Marcus heard himself say. I'm sure you're not, Michael said, and his tone suggested he absolutely did not believe this. But you see the position you've put yourself in. A good Samaritan neighbor who suddenly becomes a villain when the narrative changes. It's quite a fall. He hung up. Marcus stood in his bedroom, phone still in hand, and watched the pool die. He understood now that he'd been outmaneuvered at every level. Karen had needed him to keep the pool open. She'd also needed him to destroy it. She'd played both roles perfectly, had positioned him so that whichever choice he made would make him look like the villain. If he kept the pool, he was a pushover using someone else's children for emotional validation. If he destroyed it, he was cruel and vindictive and deliberately harming minors. There was no winning narrative. There was only the version where he was wrong. By the time the pool was completely demolished, a process that took 4 hours, by which point Marcus had gone through an entire bottle of wine alone in his kitchen. His phone had 17 new text messages. 11 were from neighbors expressing disappointment. 2 were from fellow PTA members suggesting he might want to take a step back from school involvement for a while. 3 were from people whose names he didn't recognize and whose messages, when he read them, were explicitly hostile. You monster, those kids did nothing wrong. I hope you're proud of yourself. This is the kind of cruelty that ruins neighborhoods. He didn't know how they'd all gotten his number. He was about to find out. At 4 in the afternoon, Karen posted on the neighborhood Facebook group a long, heartfelt statement about how she'd tried so hard to advocate for her children's needs, how a neighbor had offered them something precious, and how that neighbor had taken it away out of spite, not because of any real conflict, but because he could. She included photos of the demolition, timed them to look like they were being taken as the destruction happened, made it seem spontaneous and shocking. The comments started immediately. Outrage, disbelief, calls for Marcus to replace what he'd destroyed, suggestions that he didn't belong in the neighborhood anymore. One person, a woman named Diane whose children had apparently also been using the pool without ever introducing themselves or asking permission, actually suggested that Marcus should be reported to the police for child endangerment through emotional cruelty. By 6 p.m., a neighborhood meeting was being organized. Marcus wasn't invited, though he assumed that would be remedied. By 6:30, he'd received his first email from a lawyer, not his lawyer, but someone representing concerned community members regarding deliberate destruction of community resources. He poured another drink and sat in his living room, surrounded by the silence that used to feel peaceful but now felt like drowning. That night, he did something he hadn't done since the Sarah era. He called his mother. Patricia Chen listened to the entire story without interrupting. She was good at that, had been raised in a culture that valued listening over speaking, and she'd passed that on to her only son, which meant he'd spent his entire life telling people everything while never asking them anything in return. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Did you do anything wrong? She asked finally. I tried to be nice, Marcus said. I tried to say yes instead of no, and I got punished for it. But did you do anything wrong? Patricia asked again. Not in the outcome, but in the choice. Did you do something you didn't want to do? Did you say yes to something you wanted to say no to? Marcus didn't answer because the answer was complicated. He'd been trying to be good. He'd been trying to be the person Sarah said he wasn't, and he'd sacrificed his own boundaries to do it, which meant he'd given people the tools to hurt him. Mama, he said quietly, I think I ruined my life. No, Patricia said. You made a choice. Then you made another choice. Now you'll make another choice. That's what life is. It's not ruins. It's just choices stacked on top of each other until you can't see the beginning anymore. What choice do I make now? He asked. You tell the truth, his mother said. You tell what really happened, not your version, the actual truth, and you let people decide what that truth means about you. That's all you can do. Everything else, their judgment, their anger, their need to make you into a villain, that's theirs to carry, not yours. After they hung up, Marcus sat with his laptop open and began to write. He wrote the entire story, everything that Karen had done, every lie he'd told himself about his own generosity, every way he'd let himself be manipulated. He included the email exchange with Sarah. He included the conversation with Michael Torres. He included the city inspection report that showed the pool was only deteriorated because he deliberately let it decay. He wrote the truth. Then he posted it on the neighborhood Facebook group. For approximately 6 minutes, nothing happened. Then the comments started. Not the kind supporting him, though some of those came, the kind that started the real reckoning. A woman named Susan Reed commented, "My kids used this pool all summer. We were invited specifically by Karen to come use it. She never mentioned it was Marcus's property or that she'd requested permission. She made it sound like it was just available." Someone else, "I also just found out this morning that this wasn't Karen's pool. I thought it was community property or something. I feel like I was lied to about the situation." And then, from someone Marcus didn't know, someone with an actual verified account that said, "Family law attorney." If this account is accurate, documenting Karen's attempt to obtain a legal advantage through what appears to be deliberate misrepresentation of facts would be relevant to any custody proceeding. I would recommend Marcus preserve all communications and provide them to his attorney if contacted by any court. The narrative shifted. Not completely. There were still people who thought Marcus was cruel, who believed that a good person would simply have paid for the pool maintenance rather than destroying it. But there were now enough people questioning the story that it couldn't solidify into the single truth Karen had tried to make it. By midnight, Karen had deleted her Facebook post. By 1 a.m., her sister Margaret had left a private message asking Marcus not to pursue legal action against Karen because she's struggling and doing the best she can. Marcus didn't respond. What he did was receive a call from Michael Torres again, this time not to threaten him, but to ask him, quietly, if he would be willing to testify as a character witness for Karen, to say that he didn't believe she deliberately manipulated him, that he understood she was just trying to protect her children. "No," Marcus said flatly, "I'm done covering for people." "She might lose custody," Michael said. "Your statement could help." "Not my problem," Marcus said and hung up. The next morning, Karen appeared at his house. She looked like she hadn't slept. She looked, in fact, like everything in her carefully constructed world had collapsed exactly the way she'd constructed his to collapse. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I was scared and I made a bad choice. I hurt you to protect myself and I was wrong. I know I was wrong, and now I'm going to lose my kids because of it." Marcus stood in his doorway and looked at this woman who'd played him so methodically, who'd strategized his destruction with the same care she might plan a holiday. And he felt something that surprised him. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. "You can't come to my house anymore," he said. "You can't contact me. And if you try to get your kids to apologize or say they'll miss the pool or any of that, if you use them to manipulate me the way you used me, I will make sure that Michael Torres has documentation of every conversation we've ever had." Karen's face crumpled. "I understand." She left. Marcus closed his door and returned to his life, a life that was now emptier, quieter, entirely his own. There was no pool. There was no pool furniture. There was no neighbor's gratitude and no neighbor's betrayal. There was just an empty space where something valuable used to be, and Marcus would have to decide what, if anything, to fill it with. Michael Torres lost the bid for increased custody, not because of the pool situation, but because the judge determined that Karen was a capable, loving mother who was doing her best with limited resources. The revelation of her manipulation strategy and her attempted character assassination of Marcus actually made her look worse in the courtroom. Her lawyer had advised her not to bring it up, and she'd agreed, which meant Michael's lawyer had to present the evidence Marcus had documented. The judge seemed to view the whole thing as a tragedy of bad choices on everyone's part, and decided that the children's stability with their mother was more important than Karen's moral failings. Marcus learned this from a news alert about the case. Michael Torres was a known family law attorney, and the case had attracted local media attention. The article quoted the judge's ruling and included a comment from Karen's attorney expressing gratitude for the community's support during this difficult time. There was no mention of Marcus. He'd been removed from the story entirely, relegated to the past tense of Karen's life. He found this oddly comforting. The demolition site had been graded and seeded with grass. By early November, new growth was visible, just the beginning of healing, the kind that takes years to become invisible. Marcus had received 3 quotes for what to do with the space: an elaborate garden, a sports court, a small gazebo with seating. He chose none of them. He left it empty, a blank space on his property that he could decide about later when he had more clarity about who he wanted to be. On Halloween, a trick-or-treater came to his house wearing a spider costume. Behind him, Marcus recognized David, Coren's son, dressed as a dinosaur. The boy didn't seem to recognize Marcus, which was probably for the best. His mother would have instructed him not to, would have taught him that Marcus was the villain of this story. Marcus gave them extra candy and watched them disappear into the suburban night. That evening his phone rang. It was his ex-wife, Sarah. "I saw something on Facebook," she said without preamble, "about you and your neighbors and some drama with the pool. What happened?" Marcus considered lying. He considered telling her a version of the story that made him look better. Instead, he told her the truth. "I tried to be good," he said, "and I let people use that as a tool to control me. And when I tried to take back what was mine, I looked like the villain anyway. So now there's no pool and there's no neighbors and I'm just alone with my property again." Sarah was quiet. Then she said, "You always did that. You'd been so far backward trying to be what people needed that you'd lose track of what you actually wanted. And then you'd be angry about it, but you'd never say anything. You'd just let the anger build until you had to do something destructive." "I know," Marcus said. It wasn't even an argument anymore. It was just the truth between them, the reason they'd stopped loving each other. Not because of anything dramatic, but because Marcus had tried so hard to be what Sarah needed that he'd disappeared. "That's not something I could fix," Sarah said. "And it's not something I was responsible for. So I just want to say, whatever happened with these people, whatever you think you did wrong, that pattern existed before them. So maybe don't blame the pool. Maybe blame yourself for not knowing how to ask for what you actually want." She hung up before he could respond. Marcus sat with the phone in his hand, understanding that Sarah was right. The pool had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease was his inability to have boundaries, his fear of being the villain, his belief that suffering silently was the same thing as being good. He called his mother back. "I want to go to therapy," he told her. "I want to understand why I do this." Patricia Chen made an appointment for him with her therapist, a woman named Dr. Reeves who had an opening for a new patient on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus went, and then he kept going. Every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, he sat in an office and talked about boundaries and self-sabotage and the gap between who he'd been raised to be and who he actually was. By December, he'd made enough progress that he could look at the empty pool space without feeling like he'd failed. It was just a space. It was just a consequence of his choices. He'd made it. Now he was learning to live with it. The real reckoning came just before the new year, when Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was from Coren. No return address, but he recognized the handwriting from the notes she'd left when she'd brought him things during the summer. Thank you notes, mostly with her careful, considered script. "Marcus, I don't expect you to read this, and I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted you to know, though, that I've started therapy too, and I've started understanding what I did to you, not as a justified response to my circumstances, but as a choice. I chose to use you. I chose to manipulate you. I chose to frame you as a villain because it was easier than admitting I was scared and failing. My therapist says that the custody loss isn't actually about you or the pool. It's about me having used my children as emotional leverage for so long that I no longer know how to advocate for them without making it about my own pain. The judge saw that. And now I'm in the situation where my ex has more custody because I destroyed the narrative I'd been building. I'm not telling you this to make you feel better. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the manipulation worked, up to a point. You did become the villain in the neighborhood's eyes, just like I planned. And then the truth came out, and the neighborhood understood what actually happened, and now I'm the villain instead. That's not justice. That's just consequences, swinging back and forth, hitting whoever they're aimed at. I'm moving away. My ex is taking the kids for extended periods this spring, and I'm taking that as a sign that I need a fresh start. Somewhere I don't know anyone. Somewhere I can't use people because I don't have anyone to use. I'm sorry, I know that's inadequate, but it's all I have. Coren." Marcus read the letter 3 times. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel sad. He just felt the weight of the entire situation. How they'd both used each other, how they'd both tried to be right at the expense of being honest, how the pool had become the repository for all of their failures. He wrote her back, even though he didn't think she'd want to hear from him. "Coren, I forgive you, not because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger at you is just another way of staying attached to you. I want to be unattached. I want to not care about you or your situation or your redemption story. I hope your fresh start works out. I hope you find a way to be honest with your children and yourself. And I hope you're right about needing space, because you're not going to get better by staying here where everyone knows what you did. I'm also getting better. Therapy is teaching me that I'm allowed to say no. I'm allowed to have boundaries. I'm allowed to value my own peace more than I value someone else's approval. Goodbye, Marcus. He sent it to the address she'd provided on the envelope. By spring, Karen was gone. Her house sold to a young family with no children who kept to themselves and never tried to use Marcus's property for anything. Marcus was happier for it. The absence of obligation, the return to solitude without the weight of resentment underneath it. He started dating again, carefully, cautiously, with a therapist-approved awareness of his tendency to lose himself in relationships. He went back to the gym. He read books he actually wanted to read instead of books he thought made him seem intellectual. He took a cooking class and discovered he had no talent for it, but enjoyed the process of trying. By summer, he decided what to do with the empty pool space. He built a garden, modest, nothing like the elaborate designs he'd been quoted on. Just raised beds with vegetables and flowers that required maintenance and attention and didn't promise more than they could deliver. One Saturday, his mother came to visit and stood in the garden, looking at the tomato plants and basil and snap peas Marcus had planted. "This is nice," she said. "This is something real." "It's just a garden," Marcus replied. "No," Patricia said. "It's a choice for yourself. That's what was missing before. You were always making choices for other people." She was right. By the end of that summer, exactly 1 year after he'd first stopped the demolition because a woman had cried at his fence, Marcus had learned to be alone in his house without feeling lonely. He'd learned to say no without guilt. He'd learned that being good wasn't about absorbing other people's pain. It was about being honest about what you could and couldn't carry. He never saw Karen again. He heard, through the neighborhood rumor mill, that her ex had eventually won more custody, that she'd moved to Sacramento where she was working at a bigger hardware store and living with a new boyfriend. There was no indication of whether she'd actually changed, whether therapy had actually worked, whether she'd stopped using people once she found new ones to use. It didn't matter. Her life wasn't his responsibility anymore. His life was. The empty pool space stayed empty through the winter. In spring, when Marcus was working in the garden one morning, his neighbor, the man from the young family, came over and asked if Marcus would mind if his kids occasionally cut through the yard to access a hiking trail behind the properties. Marcus almost said yes automatically, then he paused. "Let me think about it," he told the neighbor. "I'll let you know." He actually did think about it. He considered his boundaries, his time, his need for solitude. He came back 3 days later and said, "It's fine, but I need you to ask me each time. I want to know when people are using my property." The neighbor nodded and accepted this completely. "Absolutely, thanks for letting me know." It was such a small thing, a simple boundary expressed without guilt, accepted without drama. But it felt revolutionary to Marcus, this quiet assertion of his own needs. By the following spring, when the 1-year anniversary of the pool demolition arrived, Marcus was almost unaware of it until he looked at his calendar and realized the date. He stood in his garden, surrounded by growth and returning flowers, and felt something like peace settle in his chest. He'd lost the pool, he'd lost his neighbors, he'd lost the version of himself that thought suffering was noble. Karen had been arrested, not for anything related to Marcus or the pool, but for embezzlement from her employer, a hardware store chain. Apparently, she'd been manipulating time sheets and inventory records for nearly a year, stealing supplies and materials that she'd been selling online. The amounts were small, never enough to seem dramatic, exactly what someone had learned to extract without triggering scrutiny. The lawyer was calling because Karen had mentioned Marcus's name in her statement to police. She'd told investigators that she'd learned manipulation tactics by practicing on her neighbor, that she'd used his guilt to extract access to resources, and then used the city's codes to force a confrontation that would benefit her in a custody case. She'd told them that after the pool situation resolved in her favor, legally, she'd become more confident in her ability to manipulate systems and people. She'd, in essence, credited Marcus with teaching her how to commit her crime. The lawyer wanted to know if Marcus would be willing to provide a statement to police to help establish a timeline of Corinne's manipulative behavior. He could refuse. It wouldn't affect the case against her, but it might help establish a pattern of premeditation. Marcus said yes. He spent an afternoon at the police station giving a statement. He brought the letters Corinne had sent. He brought the email exchange with Michael Torres. He brought the neighbor Facebook posts and the city inspection report. He laid out the entire architecture of what she'd done to him, and he watched the detective's expression shift from sympathy to a kind of professional understanding. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was someone with a pattern, someone who'd learned to extract what she needed by finding other people's guilt and exploiting it. At the end, the detective asked Marcus if he felt responsible for her crime. No, Marcus said immediately, and he meant it. She made her choices. I made mine. The fact that she learned tactics from manipulating me doesn't make me responsible for what she did with them. It was the healthiest response he could have given. Therapy had taught him that. Corinne ended up taking a plea deal. 2 years probation, restitution, and anger management classes. The charges would have been worse if not for the plea, and her lawyer had apparently advised her to cooperate rather than fight. Marcus never spoke to her again. He didn't need to. The story had its ending. Not a triumphant one, not a redemptive one. Just a realistic one where someone who'd made bad choices faced consequences, and someone who'd allowed himself to be used learned to stop doing that. The garden in his yard bloomed that spring with unprecedented abundance. The soil had become rich from years of amendment. The plants had adjusted to their space. Everything grew with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing its place in the world. Marcus stood in it one morning, gathering herbs for dinner, and realized he was happy. Not in the way he'd tried to be happy with Sarah, through performance and sacrifice. Not in the way he'd tried to be happy with Corinne, through guilt and obligation. But in the quiet, steady way that comes from knowing yourself and respecting that self enough to protect it. He'd paid a price for his education. A pool, a summer, the loss of innocence about his own nature. But he'd kept the part of himself that mattered. His ability to choose, his right to boundaries, his permission to say no without explaining or defending or feeling guilty. The sun moved across his garden, warming the growing things, and Marcus Chen stood in that warmth and understood that he'd finally built the sanctuary he'd been looking for all along. It had nothing to do with pools or neighbors, or the approval of people who would never have appreciated his sacrifice anyway. It was just this. A garden, a life, a man who'd learned to love himself enough to protect his own peace.